Hello, friends. It's wonderful to have you joining us today for our Called and Co-Responsible seminar. I'm Jess Keating, and I am the Program Director of the Notre Dame Office of Life and Human Dignity in the McGrath Institute for Church Life. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's seminar in our summer session, our summer series. Today's session is entitled Co-Responsibility for Care of the Vulnerable. I'm so happy that you're able to join us to discuss this important topic. To give you a sense of how we'll move through today's seminar, Dr. John Cavallini, the director of the McGrath Institute, will offer a few words to situate us within the ecclesial horizon of care for the vulnerable. And then we'll hear from our two panelists, Dr. Charlie Camosi and Dr. Margaret File, and we'll conclude with your comments and your questions. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Cavallini, who is a professor of theology at Notre Dame and director of the McGrath Institute for Church Life. For those of you who have joined us for other sessions, you will recognize Dr. Cavallini as an expert guide in the theological consideration of the various dimensions of co-responsibility. We're very fortunate to have him with us today and to lay out for us some principles for co-responsibility and care of the vulnerable. John, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jess. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you all. I know I can't hear you, but I'm hearing you in my mind. It's very nice to see you. I do have a handout, and since the last time I've mastered the art of screen sharing, there we are. So you can follow along on the screen, but you can also print the handout out for yourself because I offer these remarks, as I've said before, not really in the spirit of prescription, but in the spirit of exploration. The idea of co-responsibility is kind of a newer idea, and I'm trying to find texts and thoughts that I think would help us all, maybe myself included, move more deeply into the consideration of this idea. So really to appeal to your theological imagination. That's my goal, and no more than that. So friends, I have 10 little points. They look longer than little, but they actually are not that long. I'm gonna go through them. Probably it'll take me about 12 minutes, maybe 15, and then we'll move on. So friends, thinking that my special role maybe is to try to secure the connection between co-responsibility and the topic that we're discussing today, the specific topic. I've tried to do that here. Just number one, reminds us that co-responsibility for the being and acting of the church, that's the phrase that Pope Benedict used, has its theological roots, as we've already seen, in the royal priesthood of the baptized. So that's material we've covered already pretty securely, I think. What about this dimension royal of the priesthood? How does that come in? I think it comes in especially importantly here when we're going to be considering care for the vulnerable. In this way, here's what Lumen Gentium has to say. The Lord desires that his kingdom be spread by the lay faithful always, also. So there's the royal dimension, right? Spread of the kingdom of truth and life, the kingdom of holiness and grace, the kingdom of justice, love, and peace. In this kingdom, creation itself will be set free from the slavery of corruption and will obtain the glorious freedom of the children of God, from Romans 8:21. The faithful must then acknowledge the inner nature and value of the whole creation and its orientation to the praise of God. And I added the emphasis there. So part of the vocation of the baptized, part of the priestly vocation of the baptized, it's this royal dimension of bearing witness to and participating in the church's mission of proclaiming and furthering the kingdom of God, the reign of the Messiah, the kingdom of Christ. And in connection with that provides, I think, the best way into a theological connection to our topic for today. And Pope Francis especially has invited us to make this exact connection. he picks up this idea, this theme from Lumen Gentium, I'd like to suggest, in Laudato Si, where he explains that if the faithful must acknowledge the inner nature and value of the whole creation and its orientation to the praise of God, that means to the praise of God instead of to the praise of ourselves, as though we were God, and determined the value of everything around us. So very pointedly, and I love this quote from Laudato Si, we are not God. Pope Francis does have a sense of humor, I think, but it's true, we are not God. And even more pointedly, he says, the Bible has no place for a tyrannical anthropocentrism, a focus around the human being instead of around God, for a tyrannical anthropocentrism unconcerned for other creatures, as if they have no worth in themselves and can be treated as we wish. So Pope Francis points repeatedly to this idea of a sort of tyrannical or exclusive, excessive anthropocentrism, which really means a way of placing ourselves front and forward, front and center, as the criteria of value for everything else, which really means how useful it is to us. That's how valuable it is to us. But as he also says, rather pointedly, the ultimate purpose of other creatures is not to be found in us, it's to be found in God. So if we're going to further the kingdom, if we're going to exercise the baptismal priesthood in this way, take responsibility for it, it means a kind of sacrifice of this anthropocentrism. Okay, number 4, if the ultimate purpose of other creatures is not to be found in us, the same is true for other human beings. And here's another passage I think particularly inviting to the imagination. Excessive anthropocentrism always means that we value both other creatures and other human beings disproportionately, according to their usefulness to us. I've already said that. Here's the quote. When human beings place themselves at the center, they give absolute priority to immediate convenience, and all else becomes relative, leading both to environmental degradation and social decay. So this kind of relativism based on trying to value things not according to their absolute value as God's creatures, but in terms of the relative value that they have for us, which is of course always a sliding scale anyway. So this means in turn, number 5, quote, we are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. So I love the way Pope Francis draws our attention to the way in which I, anyway, tend to think of social issues on the one hand and environmental issues on the other hand. But he's saying they're both rooted, the problems are both rooted in the same ultimate problem, this kind of anthropocentrism, tyrannical anthropocentrism, which wants to value things or evaluate things according to our convenience and use and their usefulness to us. And that gives rise to both of these problems, which are therefore integrally related. And so number 6, so this means in turn, another passage I think that's really stimulating to our theological imagination. When we fail to acknowledge as part of reality the worth of a poor person, a human embryo, a person with disabilities, to offer just a few examples of the vulnerable, it becomes difficult to hear the cry of nature itself. Everything is connected. I think that's really useful for the imagination because, again, at least I tend to separate these things. And Pope Francis is saying, really, everything is connected in this way. So therefore, what Laudato Si teaches us is that to prefer, no, sorry, number 7, thus our co-responsibility for the being and acting of the church in this domain of the exercise of the royal priesthood means exercising for ourselves and leading others in the preferential option for the poorest of our brothers and sisters. So the preferential option for the poor, but Pope Francis designates it very emphatically, the preferential option for the poorest of our brothers and sisters. So friends, in number 8, a little bit longer here, if we put all these things together, I want to suggest that what Laudato Si is teaching us is that to prefer the poorest of the poor means to exercise a preferential option for human dignity itself, since such a preference would be exercised instead of the normal, quote unquote normal, anthropocentric preferential option for everything we prefer: convenience, status, power, wealth. In other words, everything we prefer instead of human dignity, which, if you think about it, is all that remains to the most vulnerable, the poorest of the poor. In a sense, all they have is their human dignity. So the preferential option for the poor is the preferential option for human being, for human dignity, shorn of everything else, which would normally cause us to prefer someone. We prefer someone because they're rich, or we prefer someone because they have a lot of status and they can give us status, or we prefer someone because they're useful to us in some way. The preferential option for the poor is the preferential option for someone who doesn't have those things. And therefore a kind of, I would say, preferential option for human dignity, period. Pope Francis puts forward 2 kind of special cases, I would say. The first one is abortion. It affords a uniquely foundational opportunity for the exercise of this preference. Quote, how can we genuinely teach the importance of concern for other vulnerable beings, however troublesome or inconvenient they may be, if we fail to protect a human embryo, even when its presence is uncomfortable and creates difficulties? If personal and social sensitivity towards the acceptance of the new life is lost, then other forms of acceptance that are valuable for society also wither away. So he's kind of calling our attention to the way in which, in some ways, the embryo is useless to us. And if inconvenient, we have all the power, and it's very easy to solve the problem on the basis of our convenience or its uselessness to us, you might say. He's saying that if we can do that to the embryo, we'll give ourselves license to do it to anything else. And B, another special case is the earth herself, as St. Francis says. The earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail, subjected to a throwaway culture that scorches the dignity of creation itself. So thinking about the earth, in a sense, apart from its usefulness to us, seems to make it something makes it something we don't care about at all. And so we kind of thinking of the earth as the part of the poorest of the poor, most abandoned and maltreated, means recovering a sense of the value of the earth in and of herself, as St. Francis calls Sister Mother Earth, and therefore everything else on the earth. Number 9, as we can see from our work in Laudato Si here, the solution to this problem can never be simply strategic and practical, because the reduction of everything to our own strategizing and practicality is the problem. So the solution has to be irreducibly spiritual. And here's one way that, with of course practical ramifications, but the core of it is spiritual. The solution is in first offering ourselves to God as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, from Romans. That's truly an exercise of the baptismal priesthood, right? The office of the priest is to sacrifice. And so the first exercise is this offering of ourselves to God as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, as an exercise of the baptismal priesthood, which, as we've already seen, finds its supreme instance in the Eucharist, the living center of the universe, the overflowing core of love and of inexhaustible life, Pope Francis says, in which all that has been created finds its greatest exaltation because it's uplifted and offered back to the one who gave it to us out of love in the first place. And that leads us to the last point. Come back to the idea that co-responsibility for the being and mission of the church involves evangelization irreducibly. What kind of worldview is it in which it makes sense to give ourselves in this way, and in which it makes sense to offer ourselves as a living sacrifice? It's the Eucharistic worldview, friends. And so taking co-responsibility for the being and acting of the church in the domain of care for the vulnerable involves the Eucharistic sensibility and evangelization in that sensibility. So thank you.
Thank you, John, for offering those reflections. I think that you've really helpfully provided a framework for us to consider the preferential option for the poor within the royal priesthood of all the baptized, in which the exercise of the works of mercy are part of the exercise of the liturgy, are part of the exercise of the Eucharistic spirituality of solidarity in the world, which all point back to our one high priest, to Christ. I also really appreciated your reference in Laudato Si, where Francis talks about, this culture of usefulness, which reminds me of John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae talking about efficiency over being. And Francis seems to be pointing back to that idea here in his discussion of usefulness. And the way you've woven together evangelization and lashed that onto co-responsibility of all of the baptized. So I think that John really sets us up well to continue our discussion of the faces of vulnerability that we see in our world today. I just want to remind you that you will have time to ask John questions at the end of our session. And if you have any questions, you can submit those through the chat window. So now I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Charles Camosi, Dr. Charles Camosi, who is an associate professor of bioethics in the theology department at Fordham University. Welcome, Charlie, and thank you so much for being with us today. So we heard John offer these really beautiful reflections on the Eucharistic underpinning of our care for the vulnerable, that this flows out of a Eucharistic worldview and flows to and from the liturgical action of the church and the sacrifice of Christ. I'm wondering if you can help expand sort of the faces of vulnerability that we are seeing right now in our world today that we're called to respond to.
Yes, I'll do my best. It's, I think, the first time I ever had to follow John Cavallini in a presentation, which is an intimidating prospect, but here I am. As some of you know, during the past few years or so, I've been trying to think about vulnerability in the context of what Pope Francis has called our throwaway culture. And our throwaway culture decides that certain populations are, as John just highlighted for us, not useful, especially in a consumerist context. Or often in a related story, it decides that their dignity is just too inconvenient to be taken seriously, especially too inconvenient for those who have power over them. So they are marginalized and often discarded by our throwaway culture, often literally discarded. By literally, I mean literally discarded. In thinking about what I would talk about today, there are actually too many stories to tell, too many faces to put forward in the time we have, at least from our current moment, which is really a terrible reflection of our throwaway culture in our current moment. It's always bad, but it's been particularly bad over the last month or so, 2-3 months or so. But let me focus, if I can, on just one story in particular to start us off, which has gained some attention, not enough attention, in my opinion, over the last couple of weeks, but some attention. And that's the story of Michael Higginson, or Hickson, an African-American man who was killed, at least from my perspective, at the intersection of systemic racism and ableism. And I hope you don't mind, in my telling a bit of his story, I draw on the content of a op-ed I'm actually working on at the moment to try to tell his story for the New York Post. Michael Higginson was a quadriplegic with a brain injury, which made it difficult for him to talk. But he nevertheless enjoyed many activities, having books read to him, listening to music, even answering trivia questions. He had problems with memory, but he recalled his birthday and social security number with ease. In short, he was frankly living a life that many intrinsically valuable disabled people do. But then Michael got COVID-19, and he was admitted to an Austin, Texas hospital. A disagreement over his care led to medical decision-making being taken away from his wife and given to the state and Michael's medical team. Unfortunately, Michael was not doing well in the hospital and needed intensive care if there was any chance to save his life. Michael's wife, Melissa, apparently did not trust his medical team and decided to, at least in Texas, legally record the exchange she had with her husband's doctor. Both Melissa and the doctor agreed that he should not be intubated, not be putting on a ventilator, but she still wanted Michael to be treated aggressively. Perhaps she knew that therapeutic drugs like remdesivir were working well, even apart from ventilation. Michael's doctor insisted, however, that aggressive treatment wouldn't, quote, help him improve anything, end quote. When Melissa pressed him on this claim, he said, quote, because as of right now, his quality of life, he doesn't have much of one, end quote. Taken aback, Melissa asked, quote, what do you mean? Because he's paralyzed with a brain injury, he doesn't have quality of life, end quote. In response, the doctor says flatly, quote, correct. Pressed further by Melissa, who is admirably keeping her cool at this point, the doctor admits that he's had 3 patients survive who were in Michael's situation, but he then claims that Michael's case, quote, doesn't fit those 3, end quote. What made Michael different, according to this doctor, is that, quote, his quality of life is different from theirs. They were walking and talking people, end quote. Melissa tries to respond, but the doctor has had enough at this point and says, quote, I don't mean to be frank or abrasive, but at this point, we are going to do what we feel is best for him along with the state, and this is what we decided, end quote. Melissa does get in one last shot by telling him that this was a decision to kill her husband, and that it was. Giving him food, oxygen, water, medicine would not have been burdensome treatment, and Michael may in fact have beaten the odds. There was plenty of space for him in the hospital. The issue, which the doctor made clear, and this is crucial for the throwaway culture, and the doctor made this totally clear on the recording, was in fact Michael's disability. The state and the hospital didn't think they should have to save someone with his disabilities. They discarded him. Texas Right to Life broke the story on June 26th in the United States, and other pro-life and disability groups followed suit with righteous outrage. In fact, the National Council on Disability has publicly called on the Office of Civil Rights at HHS to investigate the hospital for violating Michael's civil rights. It took a week and a half for the first national story to be written, not surprising in a throwaway culture. And even that story credulously accepted the legalistic public statements of the hospital, while not even pressing on the central thing we all learned from the recording. Again, our throwaway culture decided that he was not useful. And here, I think it's important to remember the structural racism that has been well established in medicine at this point, a product of long-standing racial prejudice and practices built up over centuries. This is obviously in the public mind and heart right now in a special way. I wish more attention would be given to the medical context of structural racism. However, many African Americans have grown up with a justified fear of being treated like throwaway people. And I can find articles that use that very phrase, throwaway people, in a clinical setting. And this is important, particularly when it comes to end of life or so-called end of life decision-making. And then you add on top of it, because doctors are often ableist in their assumptions, the vulnerability of an African-American patient is magnified when he is also disabled. Healthcare providers, for instance, consistently rate the quality of life of their disabled patients worse than the patients do themselves. And when confronted with the fact that their patients generally prefer length of life to quality of life, many physicians find themselves surprised and even admit that we think we know what's best for our patients, but this is often wrong. Now, this case was caught because it was recorded. But as we've been thinking about in the context of law enforcement, maybe we should think about it in the medical context as well. How many other cases of this kind of euthanasia have happened that haven't been recorded? Probably a substantial number, though the medical community is very good at avoiding scrutiny for these kinds of things. Again, the only thing that brought this one to light was a recording. And the disabled, of course, are a paradigmatically vulnerable population, even in good times. And not surprisingly, they've been particularly vulnerable during the pandemic. Even if we want to take a good times example, I saw a story recently about a Dutch patient with dementia. Maybe you heard about this story. Before she had dementia, she previously requested euthanasia, but then when she developed dementia and she was asked about wanting to die, she 3 times denied that she wanted to die. She said no 3 different times. And the Dutch medical team killed her anyway by slipping a deadly drug into her coffee. During the pandemic, I also, to talk about other faces to bring to our attention, there was a terrible story, a throwaway culture working overtime with a nursing home resident who also had dementia, who was kicked out of the nursing home because the nursing home was paid more to take a COVID-19 positive patient. And so this patient with dementia was put into a boarding house, and not surprisingly, a few hours later was found wandering the streets. Again, someone just discarded. Nursing homes overall have been a center of our throwaway culture for some time, again, even in so-called good times, but they have been a particularly disastrous center of throwaway culture during the pandemic as well. Hospitals in places like New York, New Jersey, Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, California, and other states have all dumped COVID positive patients into nursing homes on the fear that they would run out of hospital bed space. It is often said that we avoided rationing during the height of the pandemic. I would argue this is simply not true. We rationed care away from and resources away from nursing homes and to clinics. We, for instance, didn't give nursing homes enough personal protective equipment, training, staffing, space, and the results are in. About half of all COVID positive deaths occurred in nursing homes or other care homes. And those numbers might in fact change as more investigations are done and we think about using common sense to describe some of the excess deaths we've seen during this time. Also, to add insult to injury, and this was done mostly on the down low, New York, for instance, did it in a spending bill. We've given both hospitals and nursing homes legal immunity from anything that they would have done wrong with regard to these populations, except if they can prove gross negligence, which is a very high legal standard to meet. So not only have we engaged in these practices, we've given the centers of power legal immunity for doing them. In the context of my remarks with you this afternoon, I think it's worth pointing out that 50% of nursing home residents have some kind of dementia, and that this population, again, has been at particular risk during the pandemic. I mean, virtually everyone in a nursing home, including the staff, have been at risk, of course, but people with dementia have been dying at significantly higher rates than the rest of nursing home populations. And one reason, the rate has in fact been so high that people with dementia have been named by the CDC as one of the populations which is most at risk, and so need special protection. My current book project, I'm exploring in some detail how we treat people with dementia overall in the US. And based on what I found in my research, I actually wouldn't be surprised if there is more than biology or epidemiology to consider here, but just straight up discrimination and neglect as well, because we didn't treat them well before the pandemic. Stands to reason we wouldn't have treated them well during and after it. The central argument of my book, or my book that I'm working on right now, is that because secular medicine has abandoned anything like the idea that human beings are created equal by God, people with late stage dementia will be the next population to fall from fundamental equality with the rest of us, joining prenatal human beings and human beings with serious brain injuries as human populations already kicked out of the fundamental equality club. I'm not really supposed to be focused on in my remarks, I think, at least not in my primary role, on how the church might respond to this. I believe Margie's going to focus most of her presentation on this, but I asked Jess last time we talked if I could talk a little bit about it. So I am going to finish with just a few thoughts about how the church might respond given our duties of co-responsibility. First, I think we need to proclaim loudly and confidently the theological claim about God's creation and human equality and the relationship, the essential relationship between the two. A revival of that belief, especially in medicine, is, I believe, the only thing keeping us from sliding even further into the hellish pit of throwaway culture. Second, we need some kind of massive undertaking to address protection and support of human dignity at the end of life and of the disabled, especially those with dementia, which there's often overlap between the two. Nursing homes were in trouble before the pandemic, and the pandemic revealed how in trouble they were actually. But it's even going to be worse after the pandemic. Many are going to close, many are not going to be anywhere close to full capacity. And the numbers of people who are going to need care, again, just older Americans in general, but also those with dementia, is going to explode over the next decade or two. And so we really need some massive undertaking on the behalf of the church towards these populations. I think part of this will involve us thinking creatively about what we can do to keep people in their homes. We need better and more institutions as well, but keeping people in their homes is important. With regard to the keeping people in their homes, I've been doing some research on some of the creative proposals that have been out there from theologians. Theologians like Therese Lysod and Kathleen Cavallini, for instance, have suggested that we think about bringing back the ancient order of widows in ways that they could minister to the elderly and the disabled. I often think also about other religious orders kind of shifting their focus to meet this really important sign of our times. Or maybe we can pray that a new religious order will rise to meet the challenge. I've also thought about the church's, the church as institution and also owner of land and of buildings. I've been thinking a lot about our empty convents and even schools that could be repurposed, especially for memory care and other creative ways to serve people in these situations. But let me just finish by saying, finally, at least for now, I'd conclude by saying that I think we also need to just put our focus on building up our local communities, parish life and support, especially bringing those who are aging and dying and who have dementia, and welcoming them into the midst of our communal life. I've argued that a culture of encounter is the antidote to throwaway culture. We need a culture of encounter across generations, no longer pushing our sick and disabled to the margins in a throwaway culture, but welcome them into the very life of the church. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Charlie, for your comments and for telling Michael's story as well. I think you highlighted so well the sort of ever shrinking circle of those who we include in the human community on both ends of life. And that principle of usefulness that John brought up, that Pope Francis is warning us against, that people are not based, their dignity is not based on their usefulness, but on their being. And that fits into this wider theology of creation and of us not being the masters of ourselves and of all of creation. So I really appreciated your comments. Just a reminder that if you have questions, you can submit them using the chat window. I'd like to now introduce our second panelist, Dr. Margaret File, who is an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame and is affiliated with our Center for Social Concerns. She is also a co-founder and member of the St. Peter Claver Catholic Worker Community here in South Bend. Welcome, Dr. File. And she is going to talk to us a little bit about her work and experience in the Catholic worker community as a concrete form of ecclesial co-responsibility that flows from the heart of the Eucharist, which John pointed out in point number 9, that the answer to sort of the reduction of everything to our own strategizing has to be spiritual. And the Catholic worker flows out of the heart of the church, flows out of its, it has a Eucharistic form and flows out of the heart of the Eucharist. So Dr. File is going to help us explore this very concrete response to care for the most vulnerable among us. Dr. File.
Okay, thanks, Jess, and hello, everyone. It's great to be with you this afternoon. And I suppose I'll share my screen here as well. I have a handout, so I'll share that with you. It says it's disabled. Is there a way to put that up there, Jess? The handout that I can't hear you.
The handout is in the chat window. You can access it.
Okay, great. All right, wonderful. Well, as Jess was just mentioning and John mentioned earlier, right at the heart of the Catholic worker tradition, and especially in Dorothy Day's spirituality, is the understanding of the church as sacrament in the world as the body of Christ. And Dorothy spoke about the Eucharist as the centerpiece of everything else that happens in a day. And to think of it otherwise would be to view the world upside down. And I think there are many varieties of Catholic worker communities. I think here in this instantiation of the Catholic worker in South Bend, our community over many years has resonated deeply with that understanding of Dorothy's, and we've been blessed to have a chapel at our drop-in center, Our Lady of the Road, where we typically would have weekly liturgy, Eucharistic liturgy, every Wednesday evening and every first Friday of the month. With COVID-19, we haven't been able to do that, but I think that we're experiencing the heart of the Eucharist in an incarnate way through the particular people we encounter each day. So in the context of the pandemic, we have remained open both at Our Lady of the Road and then our 2 houses of hospitality. We have continued to shelter people and attempt to keep people safe from the virus, among other things. So in the process, at the heart of this Eucharistic spirituality, as we have experienced it, is both the suffering of Jesus and his resurrection, the pain and the joy all held together. And as I think many of you probably are experiencing in your own lives, every day presents new challenges, both of suffering and reminders of resurrection. In our daily practice, we try to hold fast to Matthew 25:31-46, which is, I think, a foundational text of the whole Catholic worker movement, where Jesus invites us to imagine what things will look like at the end of time, and asks, when did I see you hungry and feed you, naked and clothe you? And the Catholic worker tradition points to that text as foundational for an understanding of the works of mercy, and combines that with a philosophy and really a theology of personalism, of trying to meet each person subject of human dignity, created in the image of God, where each person is. So earlier, John and Charlie both talked about this disturbing idea that some people, in fact, are seen as expendable or seen as part of a throwaway culture. And Gustavo Gutierrez has spoken about expendable people. And in the middle of a pandemic, when everyone is asked to shelter, and there are people right here in our really can't do that because they have nowhere else to go. It is an inescapable reality that they are seen as expendable. And so our effort has been to try to be present with them in the way that Jesus invited. And in that daily interaction, there is manifold opportunity to notice the way in which Jesus Christ is present among us. And it is Jesus who is extending mercy. The best we can do is hope to cooperate with God's merciful love. So I mentioned people with nowhere to go. We had what is called locally weather amnesty through April 30th. And so that meant that people had a place to be overnight. And also during the day, our drop-in center provided day shelter. And then that ended on April 30th, which was a date determined by the city. And about 2 months before, especially as the quarantine set in, I started asking city officials, well, what happens on May 1st? Where will people go? And what about water, access to potable water? And what about access to restrooms? Because everything is closed. And even if it weren't closed, our public library is closed for the next year and a half for renovations. And that had been the place where people would access water and restroom facilities. And I have been, to this day, I've been met with silence every time I ask that. And so our community started providing portable toilets in the downtown area. And we've been working with other groups like Black Lives Matter and other street worker advocates to try to provide basic needs, very basic food and water. And we've had many days now of 90+ degree heat. So it is quite dangerous. And again, a daily reminder of just how expendable some people's lives are seen. We also advocated for the establishment of an isolation and quarantine center. The city did open this quarantine center so that there was a place for people to go to be tested for the virus, and then if found positive, they would remain there in quarantine. Again, where can people go to shelter when they have no shelter? So the quarantine center just ended on Sunday, July 5th. So this remains a question. And I think de facto, the answer is that people will have to go to the hospital. People who are unhoused will have to go to the hospital if they are in need of testing and then are found positive. I'll also say that we've had the great privilege of supporting pregnant mothers and their children through this time in a special way through donations of many people. We've asked particularly for basics like diapers and, again, things that people who are unhoused just have no access to. And anybody with families will know how expensive diapers are and other basic needs for small children. We also had one birth just after Easter at Our Lady of the Road. And that was a tremendous gift to everyone. present, to be able to welcome that new life and care for her and for her mother, born in a shelter, and her mother living outside. It's hard to imagine being closer to Jesus's own birth at a spiritual level, in terms of how that experience affected all of us. I mentioned that we normally would have Mass every Wednesday night in our own chapel at Our Lady of the Road. And in lieu of that, Maria Surratt Schomer, who is the spiritual ministry coordinator at Our Lady of the Road, along with her husband John, have been creating and streaming Taizé prayer for our dispersed community, which is really quite large. We have well over 200 regular volunteers who normally would be coming to help out at our houses of hospitality and at Our Lady of the Road. And we've asked them not to come in the main, except for people without dependents and who have no underlying health conditions, just for their own safety and the safety of the people who are coming to Our Lady of the Road for services. So this Taizé prayer has been a form of ecclesial connection. It's been very important for our extended community to be able to pray together in that way. And I would say too that other Catholic worker communities around the US and in other countries are present in their own local communities in similar ways. Martin Gugino is a Catholic worker in the New York State area around Buffalo. You might have read about him. He was shoved to the ground by a police unit while he was accompanying those protesting the murder of George Floyd. And he's 75 years old and fell flat on the ground, hit his head, and sustained some significant internal damage to his brain. He has recently been released from the hospital, but these are some ways in which I think Catholic worker communities have been expressing in their own ways a form of ecclesial response to the vulnerability of people who are seen as expendable. I'll also say that the witness of the saints and other holy people in our midst has been a tremendous sustenance for our community. So Our Lady of the Road, of course, refers to Mary, and we feel that she is watching over all of this day in and day out, as she watched over her son. And I've already mentioned Dorothy Day, but I think a particular aspect of her witness that I connect with when I think about the worker as part of the church's response to care for the vulnerable is her very Benedictine combination of contemplation and action. To be able to be in the midst of intense suffering and tremendous uncertainty, and to really be present in the moment with that, and to be listening with the ear of the heart, as the rule of Benedict advises. She herself was a Benedictine oblate. How do we listen with the ear of the heart, faced with so much every day? The grief, I think, collective grief, not only in the US, but around the world, is unspeakable. And I think it could easily be paralyzing. But to be able to listen for the movement of the Holy Spirit in the midst of that, and to face into that suffering with every expectation of finding God's love present, is an act of hope and faith. And I think Dorothy offers a tremendous witness. I also find that Saint Oscar Romero is an important companion in these times, as he said in his own time, just before his death, his assassination at the altar in 1980, March 24th, 1980. He said, "We know what sin looks like in El Salvador because it means death. It means the death of the most vulnerable people, either very quickly through acts of violent oppression or slowly but surely through systemic repression." And I think about that in particular in the context of the reckoning that is happening now in the US in particular around systemic racism and white supremacy. I think his witness points to the importance of saying yes to life, and yes, especially where life is most vulnerable. That is how the church can be present and can speak to the truth of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection as part of Eucharistic spirituality. I also find recourse every day in Saint Therese of Lisieux, whom Dorothy Day also embraced as a companion. And Therese's little way of love at a time when action has been so constricted and people have been distanced, looking to the ordinary pieces that make up our daily life and finding God there and giving ourselves over to God and being attentive to how God would have us be present in very small ways has been important for our community. And I'll also just mention St. Brother Andre Bisset. I had a chance to visit with my husband Biff the oratory last year in Montreal, and his witness of humility, somebody assigned to be the doorkeeper and extend hospitality, who then ended up ministering to countless people with vulnerabilities of every sort, is a constant reminder to be on the lookout, to lean in at this time, and be on the lookout for ways in which we are called to walk with especially people whose lives are at stake, and without support, they will die. Mm-hmm. What does humility invite us to? If we think about humus, the grounding, the ground, the center is God, and God's love is the ground out of which we are able to be present. Andre always pointed to Jesus and to the intercession of Saint Joseph. But whenever people attributed healing to him, he said, no, take that to Jesus. And I think that's an important reminder as part of an ecclesial response, that the heart is not ourselves, but rather God's love. And I think that people that we are accompanying have experienced comfort through these sorts of witnesses when we are able to talk with them about why we're still doing this work. It seems kind of crazy sometimes, I think, and we're often asked actually by people who come to Our Lady of the Road, for example, and being able to point to these witnesses is a way of inviting people into the church and to be comforted themselves. And then finally, I'll mention that we've experienced the solidarity of many volunteers from local ecclesial communities, so Catholic parishes and also other Christian denominations have been coming regularly to drop things off and to be in touch by letter and email and phone calls. So though physically distant, they've been present in solidarity through both material and spiritual gifts. And I think there is this felt sense of connection of being part of one family in Christ, and a family that includes everyone and looks out particularly for the most vulnerable. And I think about the connection in Laudato Si that Pope Francis emphasizes in several places, the fact of the interconnectedness of all of creation that includes human beings and the rest of God's creation as well. And the more that we human beings can live into conscious awareness of the reality of our interconnectedness, well, the more we can say yes to life and to the way in which God has given life to all of God's creation. And we are invited to cooperate and to participate. And I've just included some examples here of the ways in which we've experienced this. One Sunday morning, I woke up to hear a weed whacker, and there are lots of noises. We have a motorcycle gang around the corner, and we've got lots of sirens going off all the time, and fire trucks going by. But the weed whacker stood out, and I thought, I wonder where that is. And a neighbor of ours had noticed that there were weeds growing along the back of our fence and didn't want code enforcement to cite us for that, and just took it upon himself to go out and get it done. And in the midst of everything else that we're trying to attend to, that was just such a sacramental sign of love, very incarnate sign of love. So I'll also just say lastly that I don't think I'll ever get over the witness of people who have absolutely nothing and who still find enough love inside to care for the needs of someone they perceive to be even worse off, to share their last water bottle, or to look out for the children in particular, when they don't even know where they're going to sleep that night. To me, Jesus is present in those acts. And Gutierrez has said very clearly, and rightfully so, that people who are experiencing vulnerability are also called to exercise a preferential option for the poor. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure we can talk some more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margie, for sharing about the beautiful work that you do at the Catholic worker community with the poorest of the poor. It strikes me last week's session was on creating cultures of belonging. And actually the Catholic worker was referenced Dorothy Day was referenced in that session, but it strikes me that the Catholic worker creates a culture of belonging for those who are most vulnerable and for the poorest of the poor, where they can be received and welcomed and rest and receive care. So thank you for your witness and for sharing the work of the Catholic worker with us. We have time for questions now. Please submit your questions using the chat function. I think, according to my sources, there haven't been any questions submitted yet, so that means I get to ask questions, which is no problem for me. So I would love to start with you, Charlie. I was really intrigued by your mention of restoring the order of widows. and new forms of religious life. I immediately thought of the Sisters of Life emerging in response to the scourge of abortion. And I was wondering if you could say more about that.
So yeah, to be honest, I don't have this fully worked out in my head or anywhere else, but apparently building on Paul's ministry that comes to us from his letters, the early church had a very strong outreach, including from wealthy, maybe even mostly wealthy women, early wealthy Christian women who supported this order of widows to, in particular, to reach out to the most vulnerable, including, to pick up on Marty's last point, that a vulnerable population helping other vulnerable populations, but also supported directly by the church. So what a fantastic example that could be. Now, both Cavallini and Lysau put different spins on it and say it won't look exactly the same today, but it would be something to connect to from our ancient past that we have a dramatic need of. I also thought about the Sisters of Life. That was one of the examples I had in the back of my mind. Could there be not a shift, but an additional ministry they would kind of take on along those lines? Or we've had religious orders throughout the church's history spring up in response to different signs of the times, needs, vulnerable populations, especially during pandemics, in fact. But this need was there before the pandemic. So this is a structural thing we're going to have to deal with all across the developed West. But I'm actually praying. I hope that we have all of these options come to fruition. But I am hoping that there is a special that God gives us a special order that rises over the next decade or so to meet the needs of the vulnerable, old, and disabled.
Yeah, it strikes me that the Little Sisters of the Poor, who are in the news today, are also an example of one of those orders who have sprung up to care for people who are at the end of life, are homeless, and are sick, sort of one of the poorest of the poor among us. They're not going to get better. They are dying, and here the lavishing of care upon them.
We just need to scale. Sorry, we just need to scale at such a higher level than we currently are. But yeah, sorry.
That's right. Christine Baglow has a question. Christine, I would invite you to ask your question.
I'm muted by you. Okay. Oh, you unmuted me. Okay, great.
Unmuted.
Thank you. So my question is for Charles or John in particular, if you have any insights on what you think the approach of Catholic institutions ought to be concerning children with behavioral disabilities, children who have autism and that sort of thing, because currently there's not a great deal of understanding or options for families with such children. Primarily, they are sent to the public school system. So I would like to know your thoughts.
Notre Dame is among the institutions that are trying to get Catholic education back on its feet in this country, at least in certain parts of this country, with the ACE program and obviously the McGrath Center is also very important for Catholic education, broadly speaking, in the country. I think that's where our focus has to be, is building up Catholic education. And part of what I was suggesting at the end of my remarks, a focus on the parish life as intrinsic to the human life. I mean, it's been said so many times it doesn't need to be said again necessarily, but too often Catholic life in the U.S., parish life just simply involves the sacraments and not a broader sacramentally embodied interaction with the parish community. And it's going to require resources for Catholic schools to do the kinds of things that you rightly want them to do. And that means that Catholics are going to have to put resources into their schools. But right now, I think so many Catholics in the U.S. don't feel connected enough to their parish in that way that they're willing to put the kind of resources necessary in to get that done. So I'm not saying anything new or interesting or that exciting here, but we just have to do better in supporting our Catholic schools on so many different levels. And also, of course, Catholic schools have to make what you just mentioned a priority. They absolutely should, given what all three of us have mentioned today.
I wanted to ask Margie how you became not just interested in the Catholic worker, but how you came to know the Catholic worker and start a Catholic worker, and what sustains you in the work that you do.
Well, I started becoming interested really when I was in college, and then ended up being a lay associate with the Holy Cross in the Holy Cross Order in Chile for 2 years. And that was very formative and stoked a desire to be involved in Christian lay community. And so when I finished my doctorate, I was in St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia and started spending more time at some of the workers in Philadelphia. There were 3 of them at that time, and one of them was connected to my parish, St. Vincent's. And I had actually planned to live in the House of Grace, Catholic worker there, and then came back here to Notre Dame, and there was some discussion already afoot about starting a worker community here, and they knew of my interest, and so we started looking for a house and found one, and really had no idea what we were doing. That still remains the case today, I think. But by the grace of God, somehow it has been sustained. So that was 17 years ago, nearly. It'll be 17 years in September. And I do think that what I said earlier about ecclesial witness of those who've gone before us, and prayer, the prayers of many, really are what sustain the day-to-day reality. And I also would say it's hard really at this point to imagine some other way of life. I find great joy in this way of living, and I think in the context of the pandemic, where we see so many disparities exacerbated by the conditions of imposed by the virus at this time, I think that what we're seeing at the worker is not so different from what we have seen all along. It's just more intense and more extreme.
Tom Eggleston has a question that dovetails off of Christine's question. Tom, do you want to come in?
Yeah. Thanks, Jess. My question has to do with the role of the parish in care for the most vulnerable. I work for a large multi-ethnic parish in West Michigan, and we do our best to accompany those who are the most vulnerable. But in thinking about co-responsibility and thinking about the authority of the laity, I wonder about the role of the parish itself, and if that is usurping some of the role of the Catholic laity. So my question is, what is the role of the Catholic parish itself in care for the most vulnerable? Is this a role of the parish or not?
I'll only say one brief thing, which is that I don't think the role of the parish is usurping the role of the laity. The role of the laity in the parish are co-responsible and ought to, and well, we, I guess, should feel it more. We should be able to exercise it better. I don't think, though, that it's competitive. That's all I wanted to say.
It's hard to imagine the parish without laity. They're at the heart of it. And from the perspective of our Catholic workers, so many parishes are deeply involved and have been for now almost 2 decades. It would be impossible for an apostolate like Our Lady of the Road to continue without parish involvement. I do think that there's a lot of ground to explore, for instance, right now around addressing particular issues like the particular vulnerability of Black lives in the United States in all of the ways that we've discussed. So what are the goods necessary for human flourishing? And if you look at each measure, in almost every case that I'm aware of, Black lives are most vulnerable in healthcare, in housing disparities, in educational disparities, in nutritional disparities. There's a lot of ground, fertile ground, I think, for Catholic parishes to do more conscience formation around these basic issues of life, and really to draw that connection of the consistent ethic of life, and to make the connection between human life and the life of all of creation in the way that Francis is advocating in Laudato Si. I don't know if that's what you were wanting to get at, Tom.
I'd also briefly add that though it varies from parish to parish, there is sometimes a structural problem when you have the pro-life group doing one thing and you have the social justice or human concerns group doing another thing. And more I've been heartened to see at the diocesan level and even in the parish level, a kind of combination, 1-2 combination, as it were, between those two groups to address some of the vulnerable populations we've talked about. And if that can be systematized and done in a way that can scale up and address the kinds of structural problems and just massive problems that we've talked about, that would be one particular way parishes can serve, for sure.
So friends, we have come to the end of our time. I want to thank especially our panelists and John for joining us to help us have such a rich conversation around co-responsibility and care for the vulnerable as a witness of evangelization and a welcoming of the poorest of the poor. I want to remind you that next week's session is entitled Fostering Pastoral Creativity in the Community with Megan Shepard and Scott Boyle of our Notre Dame Vision program. You can register for that on our website, mcgrath.nd.edu/summer series. Thanks again for joining us.